Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning. My name is Judd Devermont, and I am the Director of the Africa Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, From Africa to the United States, a New Policy for the Biden Administration. This is a joint event with the Center for Democracy and Development in Nigeria, the African Center for the Study of the United States at Wits University in South Africa, and the Institute for Global Dialogue, also in South Africa. It has been a few weeks since Joe Biden was sworn in as the 46th president of the United States, and it is already clear that he's injecting new energy into the U.S. Africa policy, following 4 years of neglect and mean-spirited policies and statements. He's reversed the travel ban, reopening the United States to Eritreans, Nigerians, Somalis, Sudanese, and Tanzanians. He's rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement, the World Health Organization, and endorsed Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala as the next Director General of the World Trade Organization. During the transition, President Biden talked to South African President Ramaphosa, Kenyan President Kenyatta. He recently released a video statement to the African Union. His Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, has talked to the AU Commissioner Chair, Moussa Faki, Sudanese Prime Minister Hamdok, and South African Foreign Minister Pandor. But of course, there's a lot more to be done. I'm really looking forward to see how African issues fit into the forthcoming Summit for Democracy, as well as how the Biden-Harris administration will make good on its pledges to increase engagement with the diaspora and to launch its promised urbanization initiative. I also want to see the US government elevate African voices. Hold on, that's my dog. My dog is also very excited to see what President Biden's Africa policy is going to look like. I would say that U.S. Africa policy will be incomplete if it just follows the recommendations that I just made. Over the past year, the CSIS Africa Program has shared its platform with African thought leaders, journalists, activists, and academics to discuss the state of U.S. policies and the future of U.S.-Africa relations. If you haven't seen it yet, I hope you'll check it out. We call it Africa Reacts. We've featured over 60 voices, 60 of the region's sharpest analysts to share their thoughts on the entire US election process, from the Iowa caucus to the inauguration. And I believe if we really want to build back better, if we want to develop a more constructive policy towards sub-Saharan Africa, we have to listen and learn from our colleagues on the continent. The United States has been through a lot in the past couple of years: divisive identity politics, a racial reckoning, and an attack on our democracy. And we have a lot of work ahead of us if we want to right our ship. And the only way to really do this is, if we're going to re-engage with the world, we have to do it with humility. And that's what we're doing today and every day at the Africa Program. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by some of the region's leading scholars at some of the most prestigious think tanks in Africa. Bob Wekesa is the Research Partnership and Communications Coordinator at the African Center for the Study of the United States at Wits University. Adayat Hassan is the Director of the Center for Democracy and Development in Abuja, Nigeria. And Palani Matembu is the Executive Director of the Institute for Global Dialogue, also in South Africa. We're going to listen to their recommendations for US policy. They're going to share with us a couple of warnings about how to avoid some of the mistakes of the past. But first, it is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, President Lazarus Chiquara of Malawi. President Chiquara is uniquely qualified to discuss Malawi and the broader region's challenges. The president's record as a member of parliament and opposition leader, his commitment to pursue legal means to overturn the 2019 elections, and his subsequent election victory and the first few months in office attest to his commitment to democracy. President Chiquara's approach to the COVID-19 pandemic similarly has been commendable. His recent statement, where he warned people about spreading misconceptions of the virus and affirmed that, in quotes, "the vaccine has been assessed and it's of no harm to humans," was pitch perfect. In addition, the president really knows the United States. He studied at Trinity International University in Deerfield, Illinois. And maybe it's just me, but I can hear just a little bit of an American accent slipping in and out when he speaks. So the president's tape remarks are about 20 minutes, and then we'll start the panel dialogue at about 10:25. Why don't we turn it over to President Chiquara? Thank you.
Mr. Judd Devermont, Director of the Africa Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and all members of CSIS here present. Members of the Center for Democracy and Development, CDD, in Nigeria here present. Members of the Institute for Global Dialogue, IGD, in South Africa, here present. Members of the African Center for the Study of the United States, ACSUS, at Wits University in South Africa, here present. Distinguished delegates from around the world, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the honor you have accorded me to address you on recommendations for the Biden administration regarding the relationship between Africa and the United States. I commend the organizers of this event for embodying the spirit of partnership, multilateralism, and collaboration that the world so desperately needs to tackle both the challenges that are unique to different jurisdictions and those that cut across them. The Biden administration is only 23 days old today, and yet has already demonstrated a firm cognizance of the urgency of the moment it has come into. It has shown a deep grasp of the fact that it does not have the luxury of settling down before tackling the multiple crises the world collectively faces. Notwithstanding, because taking on global problems is a collaborative effort, it requires a coherent and considered foreign policy and strategy, especially with its partners in the developing world. America's strategic partnership with developing countries has never been more critical than it is now. As the world grapples with a pandemic that has infected over 100 million of its population, claimed over 2 million lives, and decimated economies, with America leading in both the number of infections and deaths. But as devastating as the pandemic is, it presents a unique opportunity for the world in general, and for America and Africa in particular, to come together and address the socioeconomic inequalities and systemic disparities that the pandemic is highlighting and exploiting. If the pandemic has taught us anything relevant to U.S. Africa relations, it is that in more areas of mutual interest than just the pandemic, we must come to terms with inescapable fact that if one sneezes, the other catches a cold. For this reason, neither America nor Africa can afford to regard or treat the problems of the other as having no bearing on the interests or progress of the other. As a sub-Saharan nation with one of the lowest GDPs in the world, my country, Malawi, knows all too well its interconnectedness to global players, large and small, as actions elsewhere on the globe are keenly felt through the adverse and advantageous effects they have on our local context. The opposite is also true. For there are activities in our local context whose effects have a knock-on effect on America's interests in the region and beyond. The need for greater cooperation and partnership between African states and the United States at both bilateral and multilateral fora cannot, therefore, be overstated. As the current chair of the 46th member Least Developed Countries, LDCs, and the incoming chair of the 16-member Southern Africa Development Community, SADC, strengthen that cooperation in many areas is a top priority for me. The COVID-19 pandemic is only the latest area in which the interconnectedness between nations is felt. Since Africa and America both entered the pandemic storm in the first quarter of 2020, through COVID-19 cases brought home from abroad, it is important that multilateral cooperation needed to defeat the pandemic is the same that is needed to defeat other equally potent global threats. In coming to terms with this reality, it serves no purpose for any U.S. administration to dwell on where a global crisis like COVID-19 starts from or where it ends, because that kind of preoccupation only delays and derails our coming together to solve a problem that threatens all of us. Besides, we now know that any continent in the world can be a source of new strains of the virus for the rest of the world to conceive solutions for. So, strictly speaking, there is no such thing as a Chinese virus or a South African strain of the same. All we have is a deadly virus that has entered the human population, that kills indiscriminately, and that must be confronted by all of us working together. It is this understanding of the urgent need for global collaboration in solving global problems that is the Biden administration's strongest asset. It is an understanding that President Biden himself showed himself to have months before he took office. For example, on the 11th of July 2019, then candidate Biden addressed an audience at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York on his intended approach to foreign policy. It was a comprehensive address on his vision for America's role of fostering collaboration in the global community, a vision that demonstrated his sensitivity to the interconnectedness of all nations, no doubt drawing from his many years as chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in the U.S. Senate. As I recall, it was on that day that President Biden said, quote, "The fates of nations are more intertwined than they have ever been," end of quote, and called for greater cooperation in confronting climate change, international terrorism, nuclear proliferation, cyber warfare, disruptive technologies, and mass migration. Although his list of global problems requiring global cooperation did not include the pandemic, for the obvious reason that the pandemic had not yet started. It is clear that COVID-19 is now as much a top priority for the Biden administration as it is for African states. One indication of this is President Biden's first foreign policy address, delivered at the State Department in Washington, D.C., only 8 days ago. On that occasion, the U.S. President stated in no uncertain terms that his administration was, quote, going to rebuild our alliances, end of quote, in order to more effectively deal with, quote, the pandemic, global warming, standing up for democracy and human rights around the world, end of quote. In fact, it is refreshing to see that President Biden has already begun this work of rebuilding America's alliances with Africa in particular. Last weekend, ahead of my first attendance of the Ordinary Assembly of Heads of State and Government at the African Union, I was pleased to see President Biden addressing us directly as African leaders to send us the best wishes of the United States because, as he put it, quote, our fates are bound together, end of quote. This renewal of America's solidarity and pursuit of partnership with Africa is a welcome development. But it is a currency that must be spent wisely by both the Biden administration and Africa in order to achieve common goals, including the president's stated goal of a U.S. foreign policy that is, quote, purposeful and inspiring, end of quote. As a new entrant into the global community of national leaders, having been sworn in as Malawi's president only 7 months ago, it is my humble submission that the Biden administration's partnership with Africa at both bilateral and multilateral levels would be best spent on 4 areas of mutual interest. I will summarize them presently for purposes of generating discussion here with the hope that where we achieve consensus, the implications thereof will contribute to the development and improvement of U.S. Africa relations beyond this event. The first area where U.S. Africa collaboration must be strengthened is in the area of national sovereignty. The Biden administration is in a unique position to leverage its influence at multilateral fora and institutions to ensure that the sovereignty of African states is respected and defended as much as developed nations desire African states to respect theirs. This will have the effect of making African states feel that their voices at the global community carry weight, which will in turn foster the kind of cooperation that is truly mutual and equal. Strengthening the weight of developing countries' voices in institutions like the United Nations Security Council, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, is one way of recognizing the sovereignty of all countries and leveraging it to foster cooperation among them. This policy of treating any countries as children to be forever regulated and sustained by external forces has no place in the 21st century, for it encourages the childish tendencies of those nations to be employed and perpetuated as attention-seeking mechanism. The second area where U.S. Africa relations must be strengthened is the area of security. The threats against the security of all nations and all of us as a species are several, the most serious of which are pandemics, nuclear proliferation, international terrorism, and climate change. I therefore applaud the Biden administration for its decision to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, to renew the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty START with Russia, and to refresh its support of the World Health Organization and Centers for Disease Control. The third area where U.S. Africa relations must be strengthened is in the area of prosperity. Abject poverty in developing countries is a cancer that the Biden administration must work with Africa to excise, for it fuels some of the problems that land on the doorstep of developed countries, such as illegal immigration. When President Biden said in 2019 that his administration would, quote, ensure that the rules of international economy are not rigged against us, end of quote, he was right. But this must go further to ensure that those rules are not also rigged against Africa. And Africa, that is rich in natural resources and entrepreneurial spirit, but unable to create prosperity for its people due to unfair trade rules that focus on pitting Western giants against the Eastern giants at the expense of the global South, is an Africa that is forced to run towards prosperity on quicksand in a world where others run on solid ground. I'm therefore hopeful that the Biden administration will fully support the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, and ease the movement of business persons between the U.S. and Africa to leverage the economic might of investors and the African diaspora for the socio-economic development of Africa. The fourth area where U.S.-Africa relations must be strengthened is in the area of liberty. This means strengthening human rights watchdogs and institutions, as well as giving greater economic support to the countries that uphold the rule of law, fight corruption, and respect democratic values and institutions. A country like Malawi, recognized by The Economist magazine as the country of the year 2020, for successfully overturning a fraudulent election and holding a credible fresh election and peaceful transition of power without help from international observers. A country recognized by Chatham House for having a strong and independent judiciary that upholds the rule of law. And a country recognized by Freedom House as the only country in the world in which democracy has thrived amidst pandemic conditions, is an example of the kind of partner the Biden administration can work with in strengthening liberty on the continent. For this reason, I am keen to see Africa make the most of the Global Summit for Democracy that President Biden has promised to host in his first year of office. By focusing on strengthening collaboration between America and Africa in these areas, I predict that it will be one of the lasting legacies of the Biden administration to have helped Africans turn their continent from an object of global charity to a place of global opportunity. The Biden administration should make it its goal to help this dream that beats in the chest of all Africans come true. For a developed Africa is a catalyst for global security and prosperity. After all, if Africa has enriched the world while its peoples are poor, how much more will it enrich the world when its peoples prosper? I, for one, think that such a world comes not a moment too soon. Thank you.
That was, we're just so honored that President Chiquara could join us for opening remarks. There were some really important points here about interconnectedness, about global power competition, and then his 4 big points around national sovereignty, security, prosperity, and liberty. I want to turn to our panelists and joint event coordinators and partners. Dayat, as you listen to President Chiquara and think about what you've been observing on the continent, what are the 3 recommendations you would make for the Biden administration?
I think that importantly, listening to President Chiquara was quite inspiring, and it actually gauges the mood of the world, not just of the continent. And again, re-emphasizes the importance of Africa to the US and the world in particular, in terms of innovation, business, technology, and geopolitics, where we have actually we are like the largest, comprising 28% of the UN member country, larger than any regional group. Any ideological alignment with Africa presents a great opportunity. But going to the crux of it, I have 3 recommendations which spans 3 themes: liberal democracy, security, and accountability. The last 2 decades, it's been very interesting on the continent. It's been a mixed bag, considering the fact that we voted out long-serving presidents in countries like Gambia, Algeria, Zimbabwe, Sudan. These are positive. And we had more and more elections, such that more than 90% of the continent now practice one form of democracy or the other. But still on the same continent, we have like 8 present African head of states who have spent over 2 decades in power on a continent where the average age is around 19 years, a very youthful population. But what is actually worse is the fact that of recent, and in particular with COVID, there has been a huge climb down on an already restrictive civic space in terms of human rights violations, the quality of elections, attack on opposition. We saw what happened with ACSUS in Nigeria, and Uganda with the elections and what Bobi Wine had to face. So I will not really be advocating a US position that promotes electoralism as a silver bullet to addressing the liberal regime. This is not the time to talk about wide democracy, but actually to emphasize on deepening democracy, which will focus on institutions, respect for constitutionalism, human rights. Those are the big and the very hard to establish in terms of democratic values on the continent. And I come up with a bifurcated approach in terms of addressing this. One is more active engagement with civil society in African countries. The previous approach has always been a top-down approach, or say state-to-state approach, and it has not worked. So instead, we should actually look at the American culture of civic rights, democratic value, and encourage an exchange of ideas through collaboration and training programs between American and African news organizations, civil rights organizations, youth group, law firms, in all ramifications, even union. While we do this, we are strengthening the resistance to non-democratic forces. Then the second approach, as it relates to addressing democratic deficit, will be to impose more sanctions against undemocratic elements within state regimes. And doing this, we weaken them. And importantly, it should directly address those elements, not the country. Because a blanket focus of sanctions on countries eventually means that it is the people that suffers, not the erring government officials. The second point will be pertaining to security. Yes, there is a consensus that US policy towards Africa is over-militarized and preoccupied with conventional counterterrorism tactics. Maybe there are reasons for that, considering the crisis in the Horn of Africa and in the Sahel where I work. The AFRICOM works there on the continent. But can we start thinking of zeroing onto a program like the African Enlisted Development Strategy, the AEDS, an initiative that runs out of AFRICOM that aims to strengthen and standardize military education on the continent by working with existing military institutions? That will be so useful, considering that most of the insurgencies that are being faced, the conflicts are actually inspired by grievances attached to heavy-handed approach of our security agencies. Training in such regards becomes very useful. Also, skills transfer between the military should be attached to actually benefiting countries that comply, like President Chiquara says, that there should actually be reward for good behavior. How do we reward good behavior? And importantly, closed-door diplomacy that emphasizes the need for financial oversight in African militaries and encourage comprehensive military audits by these African nations. The Biden administration must encourage the African nations to also take responsibility in terms of ameliorating conflict. And lastly, in this regard, will be a non-kinetic approach that actually focus on winning the heart and mind of the people, as well as addressing the root causes of several of the conflicts that are currently plaguing the continent. Lastly, my point will speak to accountability. Yes, on this continent, corruption is rife. We are on the lower rung of the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. Out of the 54 countries, I think just 5 will score around 50% in the transparency card. The corruption is so rampant that as citizens, we cannot gain economically from any of those abundant natural resources which we own. An example will be cobalt in DRC Congo, where like 70% of the world cobalt is produced from this continent. But see how it is embedded. There is war, unending conflict in that country. So how do we address this? One is the attempt to disentangle natural resources from issues of corruption will have to be addressed. And importantly, the Biden administration has actually come up to join other initiatives which the previous 45th administration exited from. It is important that the extractive industry transparency initiative is one that the US must again rejoin to actually give impetus to natural resource governance, better natural resource governance. Then invoking the Global Magnitsky Act to fight human rights violation and as well as address corruption will become very, very important, because there are actually, it's a double-edged sword. When we allow impunity to grow, we also allow human rights violations to go unpunished itself. And we have to make the United States of America not a destination for kleptocrats. And I'll end with this anecdote. When you think of it, now there is a big thing about China in Africa. There are lots of underdeals that we are interested in. But it's important to point out that the favorite destination of kleptocrats in starching their wealth is never in China. It is in the developed world, inclusive of the United States of America. So there is a need for us to go after all these criminals and hold them to account. So the summary of my point would be a holistic strategy to promote democracy and liberal freedom in Africa. Secondly, is a security strategy that focuses both on the kinetic and non-kinetic approach in terms of addressing the deep-seated causes of insecurity on the continent. And lastly, a deep anti-corruption strategy, which sees the US rejoin the EITI and enforce the Magnitsky legislation against corrupt individuals and human rights violators. Thank you very much, Judd.
Thanks, Adaya. That was fantastic. And I think points that we should incorporate into the way we think about our policy towards Africa. I also liked how you really reinforced some of the points that Chiquara made about deepening democracy, engaging with civil society. And one of the points that really resonated from your talk and from his talk was about watchdogs, organizations like yours, but other organizations that we should be invested in. Palani, you have a very hard task. You've got to now follow the president and Adaya. What would be your recommendations?
Thank you, Judd. I think that was very useful, both in terms of the keynote address, but also the opening remarks by Adaya. And I think following from that, I'll focus on three key areas. The first is on economic development. The second is on regional integration. And the third is on the management of geopolitics on the continent. And I think the first recommendation is really for the Biden administration to prioritize the issues of economic development between Africa and the United States. Whilst the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act has had quite a lot of positive impacts within the continent in terms of opening up the US economy for African goods, I think it's quite important already to be thinking about the expiration of AGOA in 2025 and to already be having preliminary discussions with counterparts on the continent in terms of what would follow AGOA. This is quite important in terms of establishing certainty, in terms of the ability of African countries to actually plan. And I think it's also quite important given the nature of AGOA in a sense that it's not a free trade agreement. So it depends on the US administration to actually keep it going. So I think it's going to be important to move beyond that approach to try and formulate a free trade agreement between Africa and the United States, and one that is developmental and obviously that takes into account the current development needs of the continent and the trajectory on the continent. And I think there's a lot of positivity to get done there. And I think when addressing issues of economic development, the US aid policy in Africa will also be quite important. I think it's important for the US to recognize that increasingly there are a growing number of African countries that are actually institutionalizing their own development cooperation institutions. And I think this is a positive. They want to expand in terms of South-South cooperation, and they also want to share their own development experiences. So the US would be an important partner in working with counterparts in Africa on actually issues around trade, but also issues around development cooperation in sustaining that and actually expanding its areas of development cooperation. The second area is on regional integration. And here, I think, the African Continental Free Trade Area becomes very, very important and quite central in a US engagement with Africa. It is to the advantage of the United States for an integrated Africa to actually emerge. At the moment, we've only got about 15 to 17% of intra-Africa trade. That is too little. And if the US is looking at Africa in terms of individual markets, it is not sustainable. If we are going to move beyond AGOA, then the African Continental Free Trade Area takes on greater importance. And I think the US can play a very important and supportive role in actually operationalizing the African Continental Free Trade Area. both in terms of negotiations between the US and Africa, but also in terms of building the relevant capacity of African countries to actually oversee the African Continental Free Trade Area. That will mean also working with customs departments, making sure that intra-Africa trade actually flows much better and much easier. And that is definitely going to be to the advantage of the Biden administration. And it will also be a departure from the previous administration, which was much more intent on striking deals bilaterally rather than multilaterally. And that's something that is going to be quite welcomed within the continent, especially because the Continental Free Trade Area is one of Africa's flagship projects for the future. In fact, for now and the future. The third issue is on geopolitics. And this is really a two-pronged approach. I think it's going to be quite important on the one side for the US to work with other foreign powers in Africa on African development priorities. It's notable that in recent years, there is an increasing amount of external powers seeking to gain a foothold within the continent, whether it is China, whether it is Russia, whether it is Turkey, whether it's South Korea, Japan, India, and a whole range of other countries, including the European Union. Now, these are all important in terms of Africa's priorities. And in fact, the continent does not have the luxury of choosing who to actually work with. But what is important, I think, with the US, especially with the US being a leading economy and a leading power in the world, it's going to be important for the US to find ways of working with those foreign powers in Africa, but on a much more focused areas, on issue areas that resonate with African priorities. Lastly, it's addressing the root causes of conflict in the African continent. And I think this is going to be very important for the current administration. So it has to look at theaters such as the Horn of Africa. It has to depart from the previous administration's push when it came to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam negotiations of explicitly siding with one over the other. It has to come out as an objective stakeholder within the negotiations and actually push both players, in fact, not both players, but all players, because you have to include also Sudan. So it's important that the US works with all actors at trying to reach a mutually agreed destination. It has to be of assistance in Libya, in resolving the conflict there and in resolving the state of Libya, which has huge impacts within the region. It has to also reverse the US position or the Trump position on Western Sahara and actually revert back to the agreed United Nations position on Western Sahara and support that process alongside its allies in Europe. And then lastly, also just lending support to ongoing efforts at resolving the conflicts in Mozambique, for instance. And here it's about lending the necessary support rather than openly trying to be leading from the front. It's about asking stakeholders on the continent which are the areas that the US can actually be of assistance in building the necessary capacity for peacekeeping and for peace building, but also in ensuring that it is addressing the root causes of those conflicts so that when the guns stop, that you're actually addressing the developmental issues. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Dad.
Thanks, Palani. And so many of the points that you made really resonates with me. We have a huge opportunity with the Continental Free Trade Agreement. I'm hopeful that the Biden administration will take it more seriously, will embrace it more than its predecessor. And then your points, Palani, about how do we work together with a bunch of different partners that are interested and engaged in Africa, and how do we do it smartly so it advances African interests as well as our own. Those are incredibly important. Bob, you are our last opening remarks, what are the 3 recommendations that you would make?
Thank you, Jad, and thank you, colleagues Idad and Pilani. My 3 recommendations will cover what we can consider as the first point as the African policy. The second point will be around the diplomatic approaches that the Joe Biden and Kamala Harris administration may consider. And lastly, diplomacy around human rights and democracy. My discussion is, in fact, focused on what Africans will consider important for consideration from the new administration. And I think the first point to consider is actually what President Chiquara mentioned earlier, which is listening. We hope that Joe and Kamala can actually listen to Africans, because sometimes when we say, we say Americans should listen to Africans, sometimes they say, no, look, we are listening to Africans, but then they listen and do the other. They do a different thing. And therefore, that would be interesting to indeed listen and act on the basis of listening, rather than say listening when they actually mean hearing, not listening, as it were. And I think that's my first point. My second point is that the U.S. should focus on direct diplomacy with the continent, rather than engaging in competitive politics in trying to counter China and Russia in the Gulf states and so forth. I think if the policy, the approach towards Africa is focused on countering these other, new and old powers, it will fail to click. It has shown that this has been demonstrated over and over again. And I think, in fact, Africans at all levels appreciate a direct engagement rather than one that looks at Americans saying, no, look, the Chinese are doing this with Africa. What can we do to counter them? Obviously, in reality, there might be those geopolitical considerations, but I think the diplomacy that focuses on Africa should be prioritized over one that says, no, look, try to stop the engagement of Africa and Russia, Africa and China, and so forth. The second point of consideration is that the new administration will do well to consider the African Union as a key partner, a key institution. And I think this squares with a diplomatic approach that considered a continental approach as more elevated than even just nation to nation. I think Africans are yearning for integration and for cohesion, and anything that supports the African Union as a key institution, as well as the regional economic communities and other institutions of the AU, such as the Pan-African Parliament and NEPAD and so forth, and the African Continental Free Trade Area, will really be appreciated. In any case, the US itself is continental in its geographical reach, with the 52 states, comparing to the 55 African nations. And therefore, learning how America has been able to remain a cohesive country with lots of intra-nation, engagements across politics, culture, and trade will be really useful for Africa. In this regard, I think assistance in training, African Union diplomats in engaging with Africa will be interesting to consider. And talking of the African Union as a starting point for engagement with the continent suggests that actually the new administration, even as it mulls or thinks of initiating a new policy framework towards the US, should consider the Agenda 2063, which is the continental document, as a key starting point. Indeed, the Agenda 2063 has its 10-year implementation plan, which is rolling. And I think this should actually provide a key document that the new administration should look at when they craft the new policy. And I think we dare say that this policy, we are very keenly waiting to see the policy itself. And we hope that it comes along sooner than later. I think and one can go on to talk of, in terms of integration, diplomacy that is focused on helping the African continent to finance its infrastructure development initiatives, again, by considering the Agenda 2063 plan. I think we need, as colleagues have mentioned earlier, when you're traveling on the African continent, in some areas you can't simply move. I'm thinking here, for example, when you travel from Addis Ababa towards Sudan, at some point the road disappears entirely. And that is true also in parts of DRC and so forth. And therefore, the financing of this infrastructure project is going to be very important. There's been issues raised around the fact that the continent will be indebted to some countries and the financial institutions. But in fact, Africa needs more money, not less. The point should be, how do we use those resources? Not no, we don't want more resources. But I think so diplomacy around the financing of connectivity projects around the continent in terms of roads, railways, seaports, and airports will be interesting to consider. In terms of the diplomatic approaches that the Joe Biden and Kamala Harris administration will consider, I think one is that if you speak to American diplomats on the continent, you realize that they are quite stretched. Even though the thought is that the U.S. has diplomats in all of the African countries. However, the consulates and the embassies and the chancelleries are actually very thinly staffed, as it were. And so I think one of the considerations will be actually to increase the presence of American diplomats on the continent. In fact, go on to introduce consulates in some far-flung parts of the continent, such as Eastern DRC, parts of South Sudan, for example, that actually need people, staffing of U.S. aid and so forth, so that they can be more effectiveness. I think the second point is that while government-to-government diplomacy is important, or state-to-state diplomacy, as we refer to it sometimes, non-state inclined diplomacy is also going to be very important. I think previous reports have indicated that the US has actually stepped back a little bit, even though it continues to do people-to-people exchanges and multi-track diplomacy. That has reduced over the past couple of years. So I think it will be interesting to re-engage at that level. In fact, in terms of, for example, youth-to-youth exchanges, considering the fact that Africa is a young continent and many of these youths might actually learn a lot from their American counterparts, considering things such as corporate diplomacy, where American companies can actually be engaged with their counterparts on this continent, be they in the digital sphere or merchandise of fast-moving goods, to see how diplomatic effort in the commercial field, for example, can work. Engagements at university levels. I think that the exchanges between American and U.S. embassies should actually be a key point, because then it promotes research, exchange of scholars, and actually then intellectual engagement that actually can then lead to better engagements at all levels. My last area is around diplomacy around democracy. And I think here the key point of consideration is that the Biden administration is working very hard towards this democracy summit, the so-called community of democracies that is emerging as an area of engagement, following on the rise of populism in some parts of the African continent, such as Tanzania, for example, but also across the world and so forth. I think it will be, and democracy remains a key area, as my colleague Idayad mentioned earlier. There are quite a number of leaders that have overstayed in power, and they keep tinkering with constitutions just so that they extend their longevity in power. And this is a key democratic issue. I will imagine that from a democratic perspective, from a diplomatic perspective rather, it will be important for the new administration to start working on developing Africa's participation in this democracy, upcoming democracy summit. And one area to start from perhaps will be to look at the open government policy and initiative that was set out by the Obama administration in 2011, which is now 10 years. How has that worked? Where has it failed? And how does that then link to the Democracy Summit, and the ideas will emerge from there. I think lastly, one has to wrap up all this, what I'm suggesting is that one of the key elements will be diplomatic training for African diplomats in a nutshell. And I think we can discuss on how that can be done. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Bob, you hit so many points that I think are so important that either the Biden administration is already showing that it is moving towards the particularly around the African Union and the president's video message, but the fact that Secretary of State Blinken talked to Moussa Faki, and you may recall that Secretary Tillerson had snubbed him. So I think those are good. But every single U.S. diplomat that's watching right now is warmed by the fact that you say there should be more U.S. diplomats on the continent. So I think, there's no disagreement there. I would actually say that there wasn't a lot of disagreement between any of you on the recommendations or President Chiquara. So I'm going to test your ability to be provocative. I'm also going to test your ability to be precise. We're going to do just a quick lightning round, 1 minute each, on what are the things that the Biden administration should avoid. So I'm going to start the timer. Palani, we're going to go with you first, and then Adayat, and then we'll come back to Bob.
Thank you. I'll be efficient, Judd. 2 points that the US should avoid. Do not force Africa to choose between China, Russia, or any other superpower or great power that is actually engaged in Africa. US must bring a positive message on what the US brings to the partnership. I think Africans are quite aware of the material and ideational power of the US. They are quite aware of the contradictions also of their partnerships with other partners. And what they are looking for from the US is for the US to bring tangible, positive initiatives within the continent. Lastly, it should consolidate all its various programs. So it should move away from a fragmented programmatic approach to the continent, where it's got too many individual projects or individual programs, and it should consolidate those and have an overarching and compelling narrative about what is the glue that actually binds US relations with the continent. If it does that, I think it will enhance African agency and it will enhance US Africa relations. Thank you.
Okay, so Palani put on the table that the U.S. should be focused on what it stands for, focus less on great power competition, and avoid the fragmented approach. Dayat, your quick warnings for the new administration.
First, do not make the mistake of forcing Africa to choose between the U.S. and China at this point in time. Secondly is LGBT rights are human rights and they are inalienable. But just like the prof has actually told us, there should be diplomacy around LGBT rights on the continent. The Biden administration should push through this with using the soft power approach, really. I think that's it.
That was great. Focus on LGBT, soft power. Again, as everyone has said, don't let another Cold War happen on the continent. Bob, your very quick warnings and flags for the administration.
One is, I think the US should, consider not preaching to the continent too much. I think they're proselytizing and talking down Africans. And essentially, sometimes in quotes, I don't know if I'm being too harsh, treating Africans like kids, like children. So I think the engagement should be mutual and it should be based on shared, interests, rather than saying you must do this or do that. That just takes us back to the whole point of listening and being humble, even though you are a big power, to kind of engage with Africa on good terms. In fact, here, even though we are not discussing China, one actually realizes the Chinese succeed quite a bit, if I can just kind of divert a bit, because the Chinese come and treat Africans, people like Yoweri Museveni, they will lavish them with praise and so forth. So I'm not saying that we lavish praise on dictators, but it's essentially, engaging as equals in some respects. Number two, I think the US should avoid treating Africa as a peripheral area. That Africa is so low on its foreign policy agenda and levels of engagement. And I think if Africa was treated as equally important as Europe, as Russia, as the Latin America and so forth, that would be really appreciated. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. And that's exactly what President Chiquara said, right? That we can't be treated as children. And your point about not wagging the fingers or talking down, I hope that today's conversation is a start of listening to what, Africa's smartest analysts think about the continent and making our policy from that point. I guess there's a question that I want to pose to Philani, which is about expectations on the African side. Do you think that African expectations towards what the Biden administration policy will be is level, is accurate, is sort of modest? I mean, where do you think where do both sides have to think about expectations?
I think it's quite important to manage expectations. And if I could bring it this way, I think Africans have learned to manage expectations from the Obama administration. And they've understood that it is good to project, your expectations, but at the same time, we have to understand that the Biden administration is currently going to be involved with a very delicate process within the US of dealing with COVID-19. But what's important is that whilst dealing with a domestic challenge, is that it does not close itself off to the world, which was sort of a mistake from the previous administration. It's important that as the US is solving the health crisis within the US, but it is also helping to coordinate the global response. So I think Africans have learned to sort of not lower their expectations, but to moderate their expectations and to understand that the US is also dealing with quite important challenges domestically.
Adayat, I wonder what you think about this, because during the End SARS protests in Nigeria, the US was fairly silent during the protest, a protest that actually is about our values as much as Nigeria's values, about anti-corruption and about police reform. And then it took a very long time for the US government, too long, 48 hours or so, for them to even comment on the massacre at Lekki. So what should the US be doing when you have young, tech-savvy Nigerians standing up for something that is our shared values around police reform and anti-corruption? What should the Biden administration do?
I think that it's also important to commend the Democrats and the Biden and President Biden then, that even as a candidate, he actually spoke up before the state did during the End SARS protest. But now there is a need for a proactive engagement. There is a need not just to speak out, but to assure human rights defenders that, look, we have your back. And there is actually the United States of America, in quotes now, who used to be the police of the world, of course tainted, which means that they have to show humility, but who is there to protect rights? So it's a new way of engaging, but it needs to be proactive. And it also means that the US will have to get its own state policy right, first and foremost. It's not going to be a silver bullet. What happens in the US in the next couple of months in terms of promoting accountability will actually determine the kind of respect it commands in the world and in particular on the African continent.
I think that's so important, right? If we don't get our house in order, how are we going to engage with our partners? I just hope you agree with me that it doesn't have to be in sequential order. We don't have to get our house in order and then talk. We can all kind of work through this process together. And one of the things, Bob, that you said in your remarks is about soft power and people-to-people engagement. Because even while the Trump administration was focused on other issues, it was American civil society that was talking about Zimbabwe Lives Matter and End SARS. And so that people-to-people relationship is as important as the bilateral relationship. And I just wanted you to expand a little bit about what are the ways in which we can engage as governments and as people to have the most constructive policy outcomes.
Right. Thanks, Jad. I think people-to-people relations have stood the U.S. relations in good stead ever since the 1960s, when the JF Kennedy administration did those very famous airlifts. As a result of that, and as a result of programs such as the International Visitor Leadership Programs, and the Fulbright programs, and the Peace Corps, and so forth, some of the leaders on the African continent actually studied in the US, including Chiquara, who just spoke now. And many of the alumni of many of these programs have gone on to play leading roles. However, as I mentioned earlier, reports indicate that the US over the past couple of years has actually backpedaled or lessened engagement of these kinds of relations. And I think that needs to be boosted, particularly, in my opinion, in an area such as youth-to-youth engagement. I think we do recall that Africa has a youth bulge, but it can actually, as has been pointed out many times, it can actually be very dangerous because it can explode if there's no employment and so forth. And therefore, people-to-people engagement at the level of youth engagement would be very interesting. Considering programs where Americans can come over the continent to teach at our universities, which are stretched, or considering some of the most brilliant Africans to go to American centers of excellence such as Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and so forth, will be very important because it will help to provide solutions that in fact can help mitigate the youth problem that is actually going to burst on us almost in worse cases than happened with the Arab Spring. Thank you.
I'm really glad that you brought up education, Bob, because I recently did a Bloomberg op-ed, and do you know that 20% of all sub-Saharan African presidents or prime ministers studied in the United States? President Chiquara studied in the United States. So that back and forth between the continent and the US is about the next leaders of Africa. It's about the next leaders of the US and Africa policy, and it's financially profitable for everyone. African students in 2019 brought $1.7 billion to the US economy. So this education point is important for soft power, is important for politics, is important for the economy. It's important for mutual understanding. I'm really glad that you brought that up. We have just, a couple minutes left. So I'm just gonna summarize some of the points that I heard from every speaker, including the president, that we have an opportunity here to reset our relationships with the continent. The expectations may be managed, Palani, but there is a sense that there's a new opening here, particularly around democracy and governance. If we talk with humility, if we invest in watchdogs and civil societies, if we do what Adayat said, if we have your back, I think that was a message that came clear. Another one that was very clear from everyone is the Continental Free Trade Agreement is important, and we need to support that. We also have to think through AGOA and the FTA with Kenya. We're about to enter a world where the US trading relationships with the continent is really going to be a patchwork of agreements, patchwork of different arrangements. And how do we work that out so it benefits everyone? And then finally, let me say, I thought that Adayat's comments and President Chiquara's comments about security partnerships and getting that right, the kinetic and non-kinetic, are essential. I hope the Biden administration hears what you've had to say today and thinks through efficacy, thinks through building defense institutions in the right way. And of course, I can't miss what every single person has said multiple times about how do we get the US and African relationships to work and not make it about anti-China, anti-this, anti-that. There are, I believe, some things that we should be worried about as the US in terms of what China does. There are some things that African governments and people should be worried about, but we have to be first and foremost about what we stand for before we talk about the negatives. And we have to be working multilaterally to do the things that are so important, like infrastructure investment and to create transparency. So I think that you have given us so much to think about. I hope the Biden team is listening to your remarks, to President Chiquara's remarks. We'll publish a summary of some of these points by the four of us, And I hope everyone will continue to join us and to go to your, very esteemed institutions for your analysis. It's great work. So thank you so much to President Chiquara, of course, for his opening remarks, to Palani, to Bob, and Adayat. And I look forward to an opportunity to have this conversation again. Have a great day.